Four, three, two, one, go. Hello, Zeke. How are you doing today?
I'm doing pretty well. How are you?
I'm doing pretty good. How's your summer been so far?
It's been pretty good. You
That's
know,
good. What
scheduling
do
for the
you,
summer and stuff.
oh yeah, that's always good. But it seems every summer it seems it goes by faster than the school year, which is kind of unfortunate.
Yeah, I mean, it's just like how you spend your time and stuff, how you allot your time to different activities that you plan on participating in.
hmm I just wanted to go like straight off the boat, I guess, into the first thing I was thinking about. I saw in the news earlier today about this the Chinese national story with they were photographing a Key West base, and all three of them were actually sentenced. And I think it's kind of part of a broader, not issue, but sort of like a planned program in a sense of not just like Chinese agents working on behalf of the government, but also like Russian agents and or other foreign entities, like trying to get the larger sense of U.S. intellectual property. What do you think of that?
Well, I think it's a finicky issue because since the founding of the People's Republic of China, our relationship with them has been finicky. Um, it got better like during Ronald Reagan's time, I think,
Mhm.
especially when he agreed with their one China policy.
Yeah.
That really helped um, ease tensions. But I really think that was like the peak. In perspective, of course. I'm sure there were other highs in our relationship with them, but that was the local maximum, you could say. Um, yeah, especially with Trump. He is a businessman,
Yeah.
and the thing is, he comes into the picture, and he has talks with their prime minister, and I think it's prime minister. What is it? It's a prime minister.
Chairman? Chairman?
Chairman. Okay.
Hmm.
He speaks with their chairman, and he agrees to support the one China policy, which was interesting to me when I heard about that, because I thought that when Reagan agreed to support that policy, that it was like something that had been settled, between
Hmm.
America and China, but I guess not. And so what Trump did was he agreed to like keep the one China policy as something that the America held dearly. And then right after he spoke with the chairman, he got on the phone with the Taiwan
Yeah. Yeah.
leader, and he starts talking to them about
Which
about
and that hasn't happened in like what decades that a president has
yeah,
spoken with the leader of Taiwan.
yeah. It,
Do
it
you
was
think?
very interesting.
I
It
think.
was like it's a classic business move. Sorry.
I think currently with the current Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, he's kind of taken a hardline stance against China, which we haven't had under both Bush and Obama. Really, in the previous two administrations, kind of upheld this like appeasement policy towards China, and
Hmm.
we have Trump really the first not to take like a hardline stance, but to actually like doubt what they're saying and actually
Setting
like
boundaries.
setting boundaries in a sense. Yeah. And we have the tariff war, which you can say is good or bad. There's arguments for both ways, but it's it's really going against the grain of what we've dealt with. So
Definitely.
I guess in a broader sense, do you think the current administration has helped or hurt our or Taiwan's position?
That is an interesting question. Before I go to Taiwan, I will say that I think the administration has hurt our relationship with China greatly.
Hmm.
However, I think it has benefited the American people, which I'll go more into in a second. And in terms of Taiwan, it's definitely helped our relationship with Taiwan. And I don't think the Taiwanese relationship with the Chinese and the Chinese relationship like between those two countries, I don't think that was ever like I don't think it ever reached like 100% like no tension.
I
Um,
don't think it would really.
yeah, it can. Like the whole like Taiwan is literally like the North Korea to like South Korea, right? So um, I I think it's better off for Taiwan actually because they're getting an ally now that there's no limit to how close we can get with that country, as
Hmm.
to like China and Taiwan, I think could only get so close. Um, like if you look back in history, like there's a border there, there's a line, there's a limit. You can't
Hmm.
get any closer than a certain point. But America, we could literally just like become straight up allies with them, which they would never have gotten with China or any of the other countries allied with China.
Yeah.
And America is still considered like the more intellectually powerful country still, which I think might change in the years to come with
Hmm.
you know the advent of um, other stuff.
Yeah, I think one of the big issues though still is the fact that like if China were to invade Taiwan like it's attempted to back in I believe the 50s, um, I don't see the United States coming to Taiwan's aid in that event because like any friendship we might have towards Taiwan or deference we had, it can't be really brought back to the point that we had with the nationalists during the Chinese Civil War, and
Oh,
yet
for
they still
sure.
lost. Yeah.
Hmm. Um, well, that's a good point. However, I think that Trump is really like changing a lot of ways we deal with other nations in
Hmm.
terms of like Rocket Man and North Korea
Yeah.
and other countries. I get what you're saying. I think China and its nationalist party moving to Taiwan and America's relationship to that party at the time won't be the same with our current administration, and it probably won't get to that point again. But I mean, there are different angles that we can try to become friendlier with Taiwan, such as economic routes.
Hmm.
I think that's a uh, possible way to get more acquainted with Taiwan.
Hmm.
I don't know. Mostly, I agree with you. Yeah.
Yeah. Would you see Chinese unity with Taiwan or like the island of Formosa like in the near future, or do you think it's just going to be cemented?
I I think that China, in the near future, no. I think
Hmm.
that China is right now focusing on itself. If you've looked into the news lately, they recently passed some type of mandate. I haven't looked too much into it yet, but they've passed a mandate talking about how they're going to decrease the amount of English spoken at schools or something to,
Really?
yeah, it's really interesting. It's to preserve Chinese culture, which
Hmm.
a lot of people, including myself, think is quite silly. But I might be biased since I'm American. Um,
Hmm.
it's obviously an attack on America. It most definitely is.
Yeah.
Recently, for the past like decade or so, I think everything they've done has been to try to top America because I mean, really, they're just being held back by us. Honestly,
Hmm.
in any case, if they are being held back, it's because of us. Because they have only been taking strides to better themselves in terms of like
Exactly.
their nation. They recently started a massive infrastructure project that'll include building tons of road systems, like many road
Yeah.
systems all across
BRI.
China, which is very interesting because it's been shown that countries that have large road systems, like specifically like highways and then roads going to the more rural areas, those really help keep the country from falling into I guess societal destruction because
Hmm.
the roads allow for everything like communication, um, transportation, of course, and a lot of other stuff. And like you can see that in Rome when they built their road systems, it allowed them to have better control of the countries that they took over. America, a lot of its manifest destiny, but a lot of what's the word urbanization is attributed to America's increase in road systems after, of course, like, crossing into California and stuff. Like, obviously, that was its own thing and the railroads and all that. But like the exponential increase in urbanization throughout America is often attributed to the road systems.
Hmm.
And so China taking a step to this, I keep interrupting you.
Yeah, no problem. So I think what you're talking about, like with the road systems and the infrastructure, it's part of China's like broader Belt and Road Initiative to build this infrastructure, not just in China but in other countries, specifically in Africa. But
Interesting.
when we talk about like the rural populations, specifically the Uyghurs, we see like the surveillance and reconnaissance technology being like packaged in part of these infrastructure projects, where we see like the extension of China's social credit system in like further oppression of like the Uyghur people in or Western China. And like it solves their own political gains, and like you said, it kind of quells discontent that like these minority populations within China might have had with like the majority Han
Hmm.
population.
Okay, that's interesting. I did
Yeah.
not know about that actually.
Mm. But I think what the big issue though is that the surveillance technology is not just being used within China, it's being
Hmm.
exported to these African countries as well. And it could prove kind of detrimental because I think it was either Zimbabwe or the Congo. I think it was Zimbabwe where Chinese um, surveillance technology had helped quell a protest against the government there. And it's like they're propping up these regimes that might have been toppled otherwise. And it's just fueling their political gain because they don't really care about the people in these countries. They just stand to economically profit.
Okay. I think that if America gets any losses from this whole Chinese African situation that you've described, it's only on
Mm,
America. It's like
yeah.
only on America. Um, we've spent so much time in Iraq and like in the Euphrates River region, like for so long, and it's obviously for the oil that's over there, right?
Yeah.
Mainly, and I'm sure there are other like ways to profit. Like I know they gave weapons to ISIS before it became a terrorist organization, and they definitely profited there as well. I think that even though they've ignored Africa for so long, and Africa has been in such desolation due to its corrupt government and systems, political systems over there. I think China taking a lead in helping to cultivate Africa and to, it seems, modernize it from what you've told me. I think
Hmm.
that's great. It's unfortunate that it's China, not America, that's doing this.
Yeah.
But honestly, for those people in Africa, that's wonderful. You
Yeah.
know?
I think one of the bigger issues is the US has kind of pulled itself into more of an isolationist position since the fall of the Soviet Union in regards to like these less contentious areas, specifically like Africa and Europe, where like we had like this, we believed in like the domino effect essentially, where like if Russia takes control of one African country, then they might take control of the other. So we would go in and we would build these bases in Africa. What we see now, we don't see like this kind of same expansion of the US, like with our military and like even economic assets. And yeah, we have China. I think they, in East Africa, they just built a new base and they're actually like building new ports for these African countries. And like a lot of them are just exporting straight to China essentially. And they're profiting from the natural resources that they might not be able to get otherwise, and the US is just left like doing nothing essentially.
Yeah, I agree. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah. So just going back to the original story though with the Chinese nationalists, do you think so? I think two of them were sentenced to 12 months and then one of them was sentenced to 9 months. Do you think that is a sufficient sentence for them, or do you think they should have been sentenced to more or less?
That's a very good question. I think that since they are Chinese nationalists, I think this is good for now because it's sending a message to
Hmm.
China and anyone who's sympathizing with the Chinese goals, like in this decade.
Hmm.
I don't think that it needs to be very harsh. I know they're just basically going to prison. They're serving less than a year sentence, around a year sentence. Um, right now, I think we are still in the warning stages. I don't think we should be in the warning stages. I think we should be past the warning stages. especially after we've seen how China is hacking into America's, cyberspace basically. And I
Mhm.
mean, it's not just China that's doing that. We are certain that Russia is doing that as well. It's just China has been pretty bad about it with that electronics company. What is it? Huawei.
Huawei, yeah.
I'm yeah, I might be pronouncing that wrong. I guess we have to start at the warning stage. We can't just straight out go all out war or Cold War type situation on them. That would be very, very silly. That would not be wise.
Mhm.
So we're starting too late, but we are at the warning stages. So I think it's a fair sentence. I think it's a fair sentence,
Mhm.
taking everything into consideration.
Would you say you agree with the Trump administration's move to possibly like cancel educational visas from Chinese nationals?
I think once again, it's just a warning.
Hmm.
It's it's showing that we still have power and that we're not a spineless nation. You know,
Hmm.
we're showing that we are still one of the more important countries in um, in the into international playground. I think what he did was pretty smart. I would
Hmm.
not go against it.
I think one of the big issues is we see like not even students but like professors who are like allied, even if they're not Chinese nationals, but even like American citizens who are being paid large sums of money from Chinese companies to like send over information in intellectual property. And I think I read a study, and I'm not specifically sure what it totals to, but the the cost of the intellectual property theft between just the US and China is like over 500 billion or something astronomical. It's huge.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense because recently data has become a much more valuable asset than you know than oil and gold in terms of a um, intelligence market that's starting to come up obviously. um, I think that with this new race, I guess, to get as much information about other countries as possible, there are no real regulations in terms of like international cyberspace, for lack of better terminology. I think it's really scary for all parties involved. I know China has its massive firewall that is always spoken about. We don't have anything like that, and I know that
Mm,
China does it to monitor their citizens. We obviously are monitored, like in America, but the firewall also serves the purpose in China to protect the citizens from hacks that could happen, which we don't have. It's kind of like our I guess soldiers, if there were such a thing in cyberspace, are more watching us than watching for the enemy.
mhm.
And as this data market grows, it's only going to become worse. For us, not for the government, and not really for anyone else involved in the situation, as much as it is bad for the American people, because our data is then sold to advertisers. Advertisers can manipulate us, and people don't seem to see that, and it's really scary.
Yeah, I would tend to agree. I think it's part of a broader issue where people don't understand how much they're really worth, not in like a physical sense, but like in a digital sense. And it's in part due to a lack of education, I think. And then also on a legislative level, there's so much capability for the government to be essentially just mining us at their own will. And we don't even know about half the stuff they're doing.
100%. You have to remember that 50% of the population is dumber than the average person.
Yeah.
Um, it's scary to think about that because it actually makes me like feel really bad for so many people. They don't realize how they're just being exploited by the government they think protects them.
Hmm.
As the generations go on, of course, people will realize um, that the government is not their friend in the sense that they think it is. Of course, the government is important. I'm not an anarchist. Governments are important to keep regulations, to maintain a society. They're very important. However, I think, unfortunately, people who learn about this flaw in their government in the point of trust, right? They can't trust their government when they grow up and realize this. It can lead to extremism. I think that's where a lot of extremism stems for. It's just a
Hmm.
theory, of course. People realize that they can't trust their government to do things that they would like to have done for them, and then they
Hmm.
feel like they need to take it into their own hands, and that's not good for any society, as we can see around us right now.
Yeah, I think lately, I think mainly specifically during the Trump administration, we have seen a rise in both left and right wing, probably maybe a little bit more right wing, like extremism,
Hmm.
not just activism, but like taking up arms against the
Yeah.
other side in like a race to see who can try and like, I guess in a sense, liberate America in their own eyes from the government that they feel has failed them. But do you think there's like any way that the government right now can like increase
Rectify.
trust with the
Yeah.
rectify with the people in a sense?
There's always a point in which it becomes too late.
Mm,
I think we're very far away from that point, and I think also the government will work very hard to keep us from ever getting to that point. I think it's going to be the latter, and I think they're going to succeed in keeping us from ever getting to the point of an overthrow of any ideological or physical means. Um, it's so ingrained in society, and that's what's so interesting, because it doesn't matter who is louder. It matters who is in more control of the individual. I know there's this book written uh, a long time ago. I don't remember the exact date. It's called Machiavelli's The Prince, and it
mm-hmm,
was written by obviously Machiavelli, and he was writing to a prince of his region uh, to try to curry favor with him. And it was basically how to control the populace in the best way possible for the prince. So Machiavelli was basically saying, "Look at me, I'm very smart. I should be one of your advisors, and here's a book to prove it." And the book goes over many points on how to control the population. And I think it's outdated. I think that it was well written at the time, and that at that point the book was more aimed towards mob mentality, which obviously you must know is a very strong catalyst for change. Uh, that's not, yeah, catalyst.
mm-hmm.
And I think it's outdated because now we have the means to not have to control the mob to control each individual person. We can just straight up control each individual person.
Mm-hmm.
And you can do this through multiple steps. I've been doing a lot of research on this, and I think a large part to play in this control of the individual is data mining, which we were just talking about.
Mm-hmm.
Um, because people, it's so frustrating because so many people don't understand how ingrained it is in them to just trust all these companies and all on this government and all these different parties. Like the bipartisan system is like it's like its own mess, right? But that's not what I'm going to get into right now, maybe later. um, they're so trusting of these different companies that they just freely give away their data, and they don't realize that there are even more companies just waiting back there in the shadows, just slowly just grabbing all this data and like buying all this data from the companies that they seem to trust, like Google, Amazon, Bing. There are many ways to work against this. I think if anything, I recommend watching the Hated One. He's a YouTuber. It's he can be a bit ironic, but he is very good at helping people secure their privacy. You know, of course, doing research helps a lot. But to go back to the topic, this type of individualistic control of a society allows for manipulation of um, not just like the ideas that are accepted by everyone, but the thoughts that people think. Um, for example, if you go back to a very well-written book, 1984 by George Orwell, it talks about the thought police, right? Or I think
Hmm.
that's what it was called. And that basically is a, it's a simplified version of what we are starting to fall into without even knowing it. Like the thought police are like a thing that they're an organization that you know exists, and it's there to instill fear. But here, if we had any sort of thought police, I would say the mob has become the thought police. The
Hmm.
mob, it controls the individual in a sense that they make sure that everything the individual does is then reported back to the government. It's interesting because I think the mob mentality, which was the way to control the people, has now been like shifted to the left or to the right, and made way for a straight line from the government to the individual. But there is still the mob mentality, which is still dictated by the government, and that's like, I guess, a safety net in case something happened. Sort of like we have now with George Floyd. Um,
Hmm.
it's interesting because it's so weird, right? Because right before this George Floyd incident, no one was leaving their house, or the majority of people were just barely leaving their house, according to reports. And then and the media was actually working against people who were protesting the lockdown, who I'm sure had their own reasons, and I know some of them genuinely had reasons. I initially thought it was quite silly for people to be protesting this lockdown, and through further research I learned that a lot of these people needed the lockdown to be lifted so they could go back to their jobs, because come on, $1,200 like a month is not enough for like large families.
Yeah,
It,
just one payment.
yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's not even per month. It's supposed to be per month, but it, and it allowed me to see the other perspective. But then, as soon as George Floyd was killed, it a terrible thing happened where the media was no longer trying to prevent people from going out and joining these protests, which they 100%
Hmm.
should have been doing. Now, what happened to George Floyd was unacceptable. That should
Yeah.
never have happened. What happened to him, and what might be happening to so many other Black people due to police brutality, is very unfortunate. And we do need to rectify laws, though at the same time people are recommending laws that might harm police in terms of like court hearings. I don't think it's the best thing, because the majority of cops are not racist. It's just this
Hmm.
large group of racist cops that make it harder for the rest of the police to do their job efficiently. However, to go back to the main point, the protesters were not spoken about by the media in a negative light as much as they should have been, which was a complete 180 from what the media was saying for these anti-lockdown protesters. And it seems like this one death is going to cause so many thousands more deaths for a
Mm.
completely different reason, and that's very unfortunate.
Yeah. I would tend to agree. And I think the biggest difference between what we're having now with the passing of George Floyd and what we had with Ferguson, which was mainly contained to that town, is
Mm-hmm.
that we had such a pent up like tension in the country in a sense because of COVID that people really
Definitely.
wanted a release. And they found that
Yeah.
release with the protests.
Yeah.
But like, it's kind of like the pendulum swings from one end to the other. We were in complete isolation before, and now we've swung back to you
Yeah.
have hundreds of people like crammed into like a street and they're protesting sure, they're expressing their rights, but you have medical experts, if they're speaking like from a scientific point of view, like it is going to lead to an uptick in COVID cases. And that's a big issue because you have a lot of these people who are going out to protest. They're usually younger people, and then they're going to be bringing it
Yep,
back to their families. And who knows how many people might be infected from that.
100% agree.
Yeah. So just moving on from there, I did read this Orlando Sentinel article about George Floyd, and it states that he was actually registered in Orange County, Florida, and he had voted in both the 2016 and 2018 elections. And it's not ironic, but it's just kind of interesting to point out, like it's an underlying note about like a larger issue pertaining to voter fraud. And do you think there's anything specifically we can do like at a state or maybe even nationwide level to like reduce voter fraud?
So I don't think I completely understand. Are you saying
Hmm.
George Floyd voted in two different counties?
No, no, no. So the cop who killed George Floyd
I see.
was a registered Republican in Orange County and had voted, as we know, in Orange County in two elections, even though he lived in Minneapolis.
Oh, that's interesting.
So I think part of the issue is like we have Trump saying like mail-in ballots are bad, which to a degree is not fully true. But
Uh-huh.
there is a broader issue regarding election security, and we see like the machines that we use currently were passed by the Bush administration, and like there's so little funding towards either making new machines or increasing the security, and they're just so easily hacked. And even like with a voter registration issue like this, we have people voting in multiple places. Is there anything we can really do at like either a state or national level to change that?
This is literally the definition of an ironic situation because people have so many complaints about their government and they have so many there's so many flaws that they point out in like every politician. I don't think there's a single politician that has not had a flaw about them pointed
Mm-hmm.
out in a drastic measure. And it's so ironic because all of these officials that are voted in through a specific process are cared about more than the process itself, which is literally one of like the pillars of this society, the pillars of this country. Not securing the voting system is literal stupidity. There's so many different ways people can infiltrate and change results
Mm-hmm.
because there's so many organizations not even considering, like I'm not even putting China's hacking system and Russia and all these other countries, not even putting them into the picture. There's so many organizations of hackers in America that could mess with these results. And to go to what I believe was your question, um, what can we do about it? We can
Yeah.
petition. I mean,
Mm-hmm.
we can ask our leaders to fix it. I don't think there is much we can do because there are so many different outdated systems and nobody really can. It's not like we could have an organization created that works on this system as a whole. They would have to like be split up into different groups to figure out these different like voting systems because they're all like weird,
All
they're
different.
old, they're
Yeah.
yeah, and they're out of date. So we need to have we need to have the same level of protesting for the voting systems as we do for George Floyd.
Yeah.
Because if we had people to care about that voting system as much as people care about all these other situations, but of course, I'm not saying are less or greater than the voting system
Yeah.
as a problem. If we had that many people come out of the woodwork and really show the government how important it is to them, not only would it fix cases like problems and situations like possibly racism in America because laws could be passed to work against that, and
Mm-hmm.
immigration laws and all of these different bans and tariffs and basically literally the politicians. Like people hate Trump, people hate Nancy Pelosi, people hate Mitch McConnell, people hate all of these people. If they fix the
Mm,
voting system, that wouldn't be that big of a problem. Of
yeah.
course, it's not as simple as that, but that would be such a large step in the right direction.
I would tend to agree. Voting system has been flawed, I think, for quite some time, and it really came to limelight. Um, and I think the only time the nation really cared about election security, which is the only time we really passed meaningful legislation surrounding it, was after the 2000 election between Bush and Gore, and we saw like this outdated like paper ballot situation with the hanging chads. And
Mm-hmm.
now we have largely, I think, all elections, at least on a presidential level, they have to be conducted on a computer system. If it doesn't have to be connected to the internet, but it's still part of the issue is they're outdated computer systems. Some of them are connected like to dial-up, and they don't have any like security software on them at all. And it's just so simple for them not only digitally to be hacked, but also like physically for you to manipulate these machines. And
Yeah.
you can just put in ballots for people who never even showed up to vote. And I feel like one of the good things that Bush did, I believe, in his first term was pass this legislation. But since the funding has dried up, I feel the next administration, whoever wins in 2020, it should be one of their priorities to secure additional funding towards revamping the election system as we have right now.
100% agree, my friend.
Yeah. All right. So moving on. So another point. So yeah. So this local news article I read. So it's not as bad right now with the protests, but we did see some more violent rioting in the previous week. However, that was mainly isolated to probably more up north scenarios like New
Mm-hmm.
York City and Minneapolis.
Well, the
And
larger the city, the higher the chance of having these violent protests.
larger the city. But an anecdote that I had, I was thinking maybe because Florida eased off its COVID restrictions earlier, maybe there wasn't as much of that pent up tension from being inside as much that led to this violence as there might
That
be in like New York City.
that is an interesting theory. I really
Hmm.
quite like that.
Yeah.
However, I was reading reading some articles today, and it seems that our rate of death due to COVID-19 has actually increased. And at some points, I think in this week, maybe it was this month, after the ban was reopened, we went back to have like 1,000 deaths in one day or
Mm.
more. And it's really frustrating that we needed to open it. Like, I 100% agree with you. I really quite love your theory. I've said that.
Hmm.
However, it's unfortunate that people cannot stay at, at home. And I'm not even saying stay at home. I'm just saying stay out of large group gatherings, right?
Yeah.
Florida made a great statement when they said, I don't know if it was Florida or just the entire U.S. They're like 6 people or less. And I think that's a really fair and reasonable number. And that's not even considering family. Like, sure, if you live in a family with 10 people for some reason, they're not like stopping you from living with them. You know, they just said
Hmm.
meetings with friends, and there's so many online alternatives for so many people, especially like businessmen and women. Of course, it's never equal for everyone. But so many people who are going out right now in these large groups and having massive parties and joining these protests. It's unfortunate. Sure, go out with your friends. Go out with like 2 or 3 or 4 or 5 or like 6 friends, right? 5 other friends, right? But break the rule by one person. Um, yeah, it's not that difficult. It really makes me wonder why these people have the urge to go to these massive like raves, and it
Hmm.
makes me very unhappy to see that people just don't seem to have restraint. And in
Yeah.
terms of like large group gatherings, like I don't understand. Is there some type of like mental need to be in large groups of people?
Hmm.
There
I
must be.
think
There must
I think it's like two combined factors. It's like one, the tension that I was talking about earlier, and also like this political charge that these people have, which we can all agree it's an issue, but it has been an issue for a while, and it's just now that we're seeing it spread on a nationwide level. Like this isn't the first unarmed black man that's been killed by a police
Oh,
officer
definitely.
in
Yeah.
recent history. Like
Yeah.
it was just, I think there were 8 in 2018 and like 35 in Obama's last year or somewhere around 30. And it's just now that it's being brought to like the stage where we're having protests about it.
Hmm.
And it's largely because of coronavirus, but I feel the administration and both parties really are using it as an excuse not to talk about coronavirus, which if you think about it in like a debate mentality, essentially is really, it has such an imminent impact with lives impact essentially. And I feel with like Trump disbanding, not disbanding, but there's no more coronavirus task force meetings.
That
Like we're
was
not
not the
hearing,
smartest decision, in my
it
opinion.
wasn't. I hugely disagreed with him stopping it. He was
Yeah.
like, "Oh, we're
100%.
already there." Well,
Hmm.
we still have thousands upon thousands of cases in the U.S. and I feel on a national level we might not be doing enough. And I do agree with states lifting restrictions, but people are being a little bit too loose with them in a sense.
I obviously agree with exactly what you said, but it's the entire federal system currently. I feel like the state systems are doing an okay job. Like the states are doing, it could be better off than it currently is. Um, First of all, Trump did a horrendous job managing
Yeah.
this pandemic. It was absolutely atrocious. Um, there's so many different paths he could have taken to avoid how high and how large the numbers got, especially since we were one of the later countries to like have the outbreak, because
Hmm.
it started off in China and slowly moved towards us. We had a good amount of time. Of course, China could have maybe been more forthright about that information. And in the end, of course, the main fault, I think, it should always be remembered that it was China's fault.
Mm.
Always. It should go down in history that it was China's fault. um, However, in terms of America, we had ample time. And in the beginning, it wasn't just Trump. It was lots of congressmen and congresswomen who did not get their act together. They did not take it seriously.
Yeah,
Um,
I agree.
I know at one point, I think it was Nancy Pelosi, um, who basically ridiculed the coronavirus and actually invited people to come to a large celebration with her over some political, I think it was some political party or something.
Hmm.
Um, and then when the going got tough, she just turned around and blamed everything on Trump. But you have to remember that Trump was not the cause of this. It's what
Yeah.
he did to try to alleviate the problem that festered in America, which was the pandemic. It's what he did that was terrible and stupid and just outright horrendous.
I would agree. And I feel politicians on both sides of the aisle, up until probably early March, were saying, like, oh, the economy will be fine. And yet we have in Congress, like, we have several prominent senators being accused. Dianne Feinstein, um, the congresswoman from Georgia, who of like basically insider trading. Like they had this knowledge of how bad it would actually be, and then they were like posting on their social media accounts like, oh, it'll be fine. Meanwhile, they're selling like millions of dollars on the stock market essentially, before the people act. And I feel it's part of like a deeper corruption with our political system where we have these people who have all this money and they're the ones that are winning the elections, not necessarily the person who might be the most qualified.
Hmm. Yeah.
Yeah. So what?
That goes back to the voting system, real
Yeah,
quick.
it does.
Yeah, and if that was rectified, I think that problem would definitely be fixed quite rapidly, actually.
Yeah, and I think one of the big things that I think Joe Biden actually does very well is related to campaign finance reform. It's something
Mhm.
that he's advocated for a lot in all his tenure as a congressman. And like looking back on his record, like Joe Biden, like when he was in the Senate, he like ranked consistently one of the poorest senators. He did take money clearly from
Mm.
lobbyists, but still he didn't have this like huge company before he went into
Hmm.
the government, and you're kind of left with that. You can't run a business really when you're in Congress. It's either you have a before or after.
Yeah.
And he's been in politics for so long, he has nothing after. So whatever he had, he started so early in politics that he had the right mind to try and get this private money out. So
Hmm.
I think one of the big issues right now is the Supreme Court decision, which was 5-4, Citizens United, which basically like a company has the same rights, or they have the same entitlements as a person for like essentially donating to political campaigns and individuals. Do you think that's right, or do you think Citizens United should be repealed?
So Citizens United is an organization that what exactly?
It was a Supreme Court case that was hotly contested. It was in the 2000s, I
Oh, okay.
believe, and it essentially set the precedent that companies can put money into politics at the rate they're doing now.
So that's like super PACs and stuff, right?
Yeah.
Okay. Well, I think that's well. The obvious answer is that it should not be allowed. It should be repealed. I guess companies should not be like in terms and like obvious answer in the terms of the people, right? It should not be given to entities um, the opportunity to sway politicians' mindsets, just because of their most likely sizable contributions to their campaigns. Um, it's very difficult, however, to just say that that shouldn't be allowed, I think, because a lot of politicians are fueled by this money, not just in their campaigns, but also in their I don't know. I think it's a much larger problem um, than what you are asking me, and I don't really
Mm,
think. Obviously, it should be reduced 100%. The amount of money they can give to the politicians should be reduced. The politicians usually don't need that much money for their campaigns, um, or the amount at least given by these like large companies. However, I don't think it could just be reduced to a small sum. I think it would still have to
yeah.
be relatively sizable compared to even a wealthy donor from just a
Hmm.
citizen's perspective.
I think one of the things, like getting at the root of what you were saying, like doing this one thing won't solve it. Some candidates in the Democratic primary were advocating for essentially, like I believe, like each person in the United States would get $100 to then donate to their political candidate of choice. Do you think that's a good idea?
I think that's a step in the right direction, but I think
Hmm.
there are again, just straight up again, there are so many more factors at play than
Yeah.
just limiting it to that.
All right. So we talked about COVID a little bit. So with states reopening right now, we have seen an uptick in cases. Do you see like a second wave happening in the fall, or do you think the second wave is happening right now?
I think there would have been a natural second wave in fall, but
Mm,
because of the protests, we're experiencing the second wave right now. I
mm,
don't think it's like in the situation of a first wave already having happened and now we're in the second wave and then there's going to be a third wave. I think it's going to be first wave, second wave part A, and then second wave part B,
mm.
and then whatever happens after that. That's what I think.
I would tend to agree, and I think the biggest factor affecting that is these social distancing restrictions, which the CDC has. and you see businesses following them. But the big issue right now, at least, is with these protests, people aren't following social distancing guidelines. And even if they're wearing masks, they're still having transmission. So there isn't a degree of protection in that sense. And I feel um, I'm not necessarily sure how long these protests will last, is part of a broader issue. We don't know how long they're going to keep transferring the coronavirus to each other.
Yeah, and it's interesting because if you try to bring that up, especially right now, you're not gonna it's not gonna be well received. That
Yeah.
type of statement.
And I think even some of the more political doctors, you see them speaking on like more polarized media outlets. They're like,
Mm-hmm.
yes, we should have these protests and it triumphs over the coronavirus issue. And I think that's like kind of flawed logic because you have lives at stake with coronavirus. We're talking thousands of lives. And if you think on a net cost analysis, yes, racism in this country is horrible, but I think the net impact on the country, it's much more important to focus on what's happening right now in the status quo with the coronavirus instead of addressing a long-term issue like systemic racism.
Well, politics always opens the door to flawed logic
Hmm.
in this day and age. Yeah. I really can't say much about that other than what you've already, like you've said everything I've been thinking. Um,
Hmm.
just politics, we don't need politics right now. Politics, it's in terms of all the situations that have been happening in 2020, we need a more unified approach, at least in each country that the things happen.
Hmm.
Politics are only slowing things down right now, I think.
I would tend to agree. And I think in Florida more specifically, we have seen some good action, at least on the local level, and specifically Tampa and Miami, at getting more coronavirus tests out to the people. And we have seen an increase in positive tests, but I'm not sure, and that's where I want to ask you this question. Do you think the increased test right now in Florida specifically, not necessarily other states, is due to the increased tests themselves or just more people getting the virus compared to before?
I was actually talking to someone about that today. I think the increase stopped being about, the increase in coronavirus cases stopped being due to the increase in testing a while back.
Hmm.
I think now a lot of people might be going into hospitals or they might be testing positive for coronavirus more so than the testing. Of course, I think the testing is still playing a part in the increase in coronavirus cases overall, and you see the general trend is no longer slowing down, but it's starting to speed up again, starting to increase. But I think it's now more having to do with there just being more cases than it being more people are tested because there was a large influx of people all throughout the country going and seeing if they had the coronavirus, right?
Hmm.
I think that that surge has passed, and I think there might be a few people who are like going in and they're like, "What? I have the coronavirus? I didn't even know that," and people who are just finding out, for some random reason or the other, it's not as largely. It's not the increase again. I just keep repeating myself. It's not as large of a factor as people who are just getting the coronavirus now due to
Yeah.
social gathering and whatever.
I think one other piece of evidence that it kind of plays with that is the percent positive of the cases, because we know, like, usually, at least in Florida, I know the amount of positives for the test, it's always been below 20%. So, not most people who get the test don't actually have coronavirus. But we found like the percentage positive has decreased as of late to a point where it's like in the single digits. And in part, I think it might be due to the testing, but also I wanted to think that it was on a downhill slope, but still, we are going
All
to
of
see
us want to
this.
think that.
Yeah, we you always want to think that, but I think for the second wave, we will be in a better position because of this increased testing capacity. And we have seen the current administration already say, like, we will not close the country in the event of a second wave, even though in all likelihood it might be worse, because we look back, like, coronavirus hit us largely in March, which is like towards the end of the season we would see something like this. Imagine if coronavirus had started in like October or November, we would see like dozens, tens, maybe even hundreds of thousands more people dead, mainly
Definitely hundreds
because
of
of,
thousands.
yeah, yeah,
Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Agreed.
yeah.
I would tend
And
to agree.
I would tend to agree, yeah. So there, I would agree that there is still room for improvement with testing, but there's some ways to go, and there's only so much testing you can do. And the big advancement now is really the antibody tests and the vaccines that we have to develop, or that are being developed right now. Have you looked into any of the vaccine candidates?
I have.
What are your thoughts?
Um, One, let me see if I can pull it up while I'm talking, because there's one specific one that I thought was really promising. The vaccine situation is it has had a lot of twists and turns. Um, First, they said they were going to get a vaccine out in um, early 2020 or like mid 2020. I'll say mid 2020, and that obviously, as the cases increased drastically, obviously it was pushed back to late 2020 and was pushed back to early 2021 and mid 2021. Now, currently, unless it's changed, it seems to be that um, it's going to be late 2021, according to a lot of professionals, and that's very, very unfortunate, in my opinion. I don't believe I can find the exact. I just found it. So the antibody that people are looking into right now. I mean, there's a lot of different, things that people are trying, but one that I think is very promising is the antibody STI-1499, and it
Mhm.
basically just latches onto the coronavirus and flushes it out of the system. I think that sounds very interesting. In fact, it's being touted almost as a cure over a vaccine, which is wow, because everyone, like, no one thought like we could find a cure for this. It's a virus, it was just going to be a vaccine, and it would mutate, it'd come back the next year, but a cure is like insane, you know
Mhm. Yeah. There are, just looking at the vaccines myself, there are so many options to go with. And I think I read a statistic like half of the vaccine candidates currently that are in human trials really are in China. And I am worried to an aspect, if I want to ask you this too, if China gets the vaccine first, would they share it with the rest of the world?
for money,
For money, yeah.
lots of money. um, China has been the worst thing about this virus. Like, more than the virus, it's the way China. Okay, that's wrong. I shouldn't say that. The virus has been terrible, of course, but the way China has dealt with this pandemic is it's just terrible. Because do you know what the phase 1 deal was between the Trump administration and the I don't know how to pronounce the name,
She?
Xi administration? Do you know what the
Mhm.
phase 1 what
No.
deal was? Basically, um, it was a major um, compromise and between a lot of countries, and they decided that they would work together to get rid of a lot of tariffs and things that were, that Trump basically imposed on China, and then China imposed um, on America, and so on and so forth. And it had a clause that was, basically, if a pandemic or a natural disaster or something happens, China can back out of a certain section of this
Mm. I
of
did
the
hear that.
phase. And they were writing this like just a little while before they announced that the pandemic was spreading throughout China, which means they definitely, like, come on, they monitored their citizens so much. They had to have known the coronavirus was starting to spread inside of China. And they waited and they put in this clause, being fully aware that this clause could be used later to back out of this part of the basically transaction that was occurring through the phase one deal. And it's obviously when Trump found out about this, he was not too happy. There's not much Trump or the United States government can do because they agreed to that, deal. And China really played this very played this in a very smart way, detrimentally, of course, to the rest of the world. Um, yeah, yeah. I don't even remember what your question was, but it's very terrible that they did that.
Yeah, I do agree. China, they definitely withheld information, and there was a little bit of misinformation because we see like the World Health Organization up through, I'm not sure if it was the end of February or the beginning of March. We didn't even think they were saying with evidence reported by China that the virus wasn't even transmissible between people. And
Yeah,
we we have people lambast Trump for like restricting travel in, I don't know, it was January. And
yeah,
we can't be so like cavalier to say like Trump solved everything because he's implemented one travel ban. Like consciously anyone would have implemented a travel ban. He did it at a good time.
hmm,
And but yet I feel China, they were withholding a lot of information
definitely.
both on a timeline basis and there was some disinformation.
And I don't know if you know this, but Trump definitely bashed the World Health Organization
Mhm.
after this, which a lot of people were not happy about.
Yeah.
So many people were not happy about that. But even though I don't know if it was the best method of action in terms of the World Health Organization that Trump decided to follow, it does beg the question, if it's an international organization determined on, making sure pandemics like these don't happen or are de-escalated quickly, what made them believe it was okay to just trust the Chinese government like that? I
Mhm.
feel like if it was the American government, the World Health Organization would obviously have gotten evidence from us, but they would have done their own investigations. And
Yeah.
we didn't see any of those investigations, or very few, sparse, not well done investigations um, from the World Health Organization. And that has to then lead into this question: why did they trust China so much? Why did they put all their trust in China? Were there some other forces at play? You know?
Yeah. And I think one of the big issues, particularly with the World Health Organization, but also with like the rest of the UN, is there's such a power disparity between the US and China. You have like
Yeah.
China sending like dozens of diplomats to like each conference and each like event essentially. And the
Hmm.
US only sends like one or two people from the State Department. And
Yeah.
then we are mad that somehow China is getting like these leadership positions, like essentially trying to handpick the head of the World Health Organization. They're a basic, I don't want to say basically their puppet, but in essence, China has huge control over the World Health Organization to the point where the US, it was, I don't want to say it was a good idea to cut funding, but we needed to reevaluate our position in our affiliation with the World Health Organization since it's not working with us and we weren't working with them before. I mean, where's the solution? Should we try and parallel China with our like influence? Because in a sense, we've tried kind of like recessed into an isolationist position when it comes to like unitary foreign affairs.
So basically, you're suggesting, just so that we're on the same page, you're saying that much like the Africa scenario,
Hmm.
where China
Yeah.
is starting to push into Africa, China did the same, and while America receded, China did the same thing with the World Health Organization
Yes,
and all that.
exactly. It's
Okay,
just like that. Yeah.
yeah, that's interesting.
Yeah. I think one of the main issues with that is I was talking about this with Brian too, but in the US we think in like these 4-year intervals around elections, but the Chinese Communist Party is able to think in these broad like 30-year terms, and we've had Xi for I don't know how many years at this point.
Mhm.
Um, and you're able to do these long-term goals, and we see like consolidation of power in Africa or consolidation of international organizations' power under one rule, or at least your sphere of influence. And the US, I don't think it can really rival China in its sense right now, is a big issue.
Yeah, um, I don't think it's possible. And as American politics start leaning towards a more extremist point of view, I think it'll only become worse for us because of these
Mhm.
short election terms, which were brilliantly devised by the founding fathers, are going to be one of the many aspects of the current American democracy that will slowly push us below China, um, such that um, these 4-year plans are gonna let me get the terminology. These 4-year plans are unfortunate because, for example, we know Trump specifically worked against um, a lot of Obama's accomplishments and whatever he passed. I'm just dying here.
Mhm.
um, and you're 100% right when you're saying there's no long term chance, especially now for ideas to be built slowly over these long spans of time, because as these newer politicians become more right leaning and more left leaning, they're going to just actively work against each other.
Yeah.
And it's just going to be like A is created and then B comes in and like erases half of what A did, and C comes in and erases half what B did. And it's pretty bad.
Yeah. And I think just to kind of pivot to something kind of related, do you see like instead of the US, more the US receding, but would you see like a country like India kind of trying to rival China on the world stage more now that they're kind of comparable in a sense, when you think?
Yeah, India is actually, I think, if China is trying to strive to be America, India is definitely striving to be a lot like China. They've started, they actually planned, I'm quite angry about this. They were planning on starting mass graphene production, which would have like revolutionized the world, because graphene is such a wonderful material with all of its different properties. But the coronavirus definitely put a halt to that. And due to this, I think India has been pushed back. Prime Minister Modi um, has definitely made some incredible improvements to India in terms of its economy and the way the society works there. It's not the best. There's still lots of disparities, a lot of religious disparities among the
Mm,
citizens of India. And I think that's gonna always there's always gonna be some sort of problem in every country. I know China had its, Hong Kong. I guess that was like American democracy pushing its way into China. So I don't know about those Hong Kong protests, but yeah, I would say India is comparable to China. And in fact, they're starting to produce a lot, and they're starting to focus more on benefiting their country as a whole. They're no longer divided as they have been for so long. They've been divided like since they were invaded by Great Britain and all those other countries. That's the reason they fell. And now that India is unifying, I think that's really great for them. Um, yeah.
yeah. And I think one of the big things with India, and I think they're more free with their electoral history than China is, but they have been with Modi for quite a few years now. And
Hmm.
like just like Russia and China in a sense, when you have that consolidated administration, you're able to accomplish so much more. I don't know
Yeah.
if it was Gorbachev or the first Russian president right after the fall of the Soviet Union who said, like, you can't get as much done in the 4 year term. And that's why Russia, they actually have like a 5 year term. And when they had term limits, I think they did repeal them. I'm not sure about that.
Mhm.
Um, you have like 10 years, which is a whole decade, compared to the US, where you have like 8 years tops. But in reality, it's probably only 4 years when we look at the polarized political climate right now.
Yeah.
But in Russia, you have like consolidated power under one party. There's no real contention. You have like, I think what happened with Putin, like he served 2 terms and then he was prime minister for 1 term to get around the rule. And then he came back to being president. So he's been in leadership for like over 20 years, if I'm thinking correctly now. But you're able to do so much long term planning that the US can't do. And that's a big fault, I think. Yeah.
Yeah. In terms of that one party system, our majority two party system, I feel, is much like a curtain to shroud the eyes of the people.
Yeah, it
Um,
is. Yeah.
it's there's no real like the higher up you go. I remember Bill Burr, that a very good comedian in my opinion, though a lot of people find that his jokes might be a bit too insulting. Um, I know something he said was that the higher up you go, it just like comes into like to it just sort of like centralizes into a singular point, sort of like a pyramid.
Yeah.
um, because these right wing and left wing politicians, even though they might be talking like all of these really extreme points, like as opposed to the other ones, and they're really polarized, as you said, when it comes down to Congress, like the whole point of democracy is compromise. So they actually start to think a lot like the opposing party, and in the end, there's no real bilateral party system. It's
Yeah.
just
And
it's just one idea that trickles down and it affects everyone. And putting all of these like all of these ideologies into like multiple parties is it they're incorporating social ideologies into political ideologies, and then not once they've done that, they're not even finished. They then group that into a singular party, like the Democratic Party and then the Republican Party, and there's
mhm.
all these different ideas. And like myself personally, I have to agree with both Democratic ideologies and Republican ideologies, though I may not speak about both of them at the same time, and though I might speak about more of some ideologies from one party as opposed to another. You to be stuck in only one party is really, really not smart.
Mhm.
It
I
just
agree.
is. It cannot be, because then you're stuck to these. It's like a form of thought control. It's
Yeah,
like,
you sign up for the platform.
yeah, exactly.
And I think if you look at it politically on a ideology map, like the Republican and Democratic Party are so much closer than we make it out to be in like the media.
Hmm.
And we think there's this huge disagreement, but they're really disagreeing about like the 5 or 10% of issues when meanwhile the politicians, they're like passing these budgetary bills and like reaffirming the Patriot Act and all these massive things that like no one, barely anyone, besides probably Rand Paul, actually like contends with. And no one's thinking with their own mind. They're just thinking with the party mindset.
Exactly. And I think the party mindset is a very good ruse, in fact,
It
to
is.
divert the people from looking at like the really actual important um, laws that truly affect the people, right? It's
Yeah.
the two party system allows for that statement for the people to be, pushed away, pushed behind, some pushed into the shadows, right?
Mhm.
Um, yeah, but like the Earn It Act that's trying to be passed is basically the same thing as the Patriot Act. I think a little bit more here and there. It's basically about data control. No one's talking about it. Like so few people are talking about it. It's not as widespread of an issue as it should be. It
Yeah.
just isn't. so many like so many ideas and so many beliefs that are contested so greatly by the masses have their equal counterparts not even noticed.
Yeah.
You know, there are all these debates about abortion and police brutality and trans rights and religious disputes and immigration laws and all these different debates among the two parties. And sure, they're important. They are important, but they are equally as important to these other like laws, like a Patriot Act and stuff that are
Mm.
trying to be like made, or these bills are trying to be made into laws.
Yeah. I I do agree. And if we just, I'm trying to think right now, with the political parties, one of the biggest issues I think with the congressional model is it just lends itself so beautifully to the two-party model as opposed to like the bicameral, what's the word I'm looking for, like a parliamentary system where you have multiple
Hmm.
parties that would probably better represent the people, but you can't have as many parties as like the UK has
Mm-hmm.
in a congressional model. And would you say you favor the parliamentary model
No,
over the congressional model?
no,
No,
that,
why
that,
is
that
that?
literally just makes it worse.
Why would you
It's
say that?
because then you have um, ranch. If you think of it as like a tree, you just have like more like shoots coming off of these different branches. Like like you've seen that, obviously everyone's seen that in the parliamentary system. All these new parties are created, and it's like if it's like if every person created their own party,
Yeah.
except obviously like simplified by a ton because a lot of people think the same way. Um, a lot of them, even more so, I think it's possible to see the similarities between parties in a parliamentary system more so than the bilateral party system, or bipartisan. I'll just say bipartisan system because you see those offshoots and you can see the connections between. If you have like these, let's say, right, you have a parliamentary system with four major parties, right, and then each party branches out into two newer parties, and each of those into two newer parties. Eventually, you'll see that it's like a torus, right? It's just there's a hole in the center between these four major core parties that everything started from, but they're all connected outside in a ring. Um, have you heard of the horseshoe theory? I believe.
Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, it's basically saying that the more extreme um, the two-party system in America gets, the closer together they will get to each other, which is
Hmm.
very interesting the more you read into it, because it just goes to show, and it only bolsters my statement that in the end, it's the pyramid.
Yeah. Yeah. I to an extent I do believe it's true. And we think like when we look back to extremist ideologies and we saw in World War II, we have like with Hitler, like he was from the NSDAP, which was like the Socialist Party. And yet today we think of him as like a far right figure. But
Yeah,
in
it's
reality, like
so funny.
it really brings the horseshoe theory to light. Like you can't say he's left or right. He was just like they met. It's like this huge authoritarian figure. You can't really pin him on the left or the right. It's kind of worthless trying to do that.
Yeah, do you know what the Overton window is?
Yeah, yeah.
A friend actually brought that to my attention, and they also brought to attention the fact that as the Overton window, which for any of your viewers that don't know what it is, um, I'll stop for a second and explain it. Basically, it's the range of politically accepted beliefs at a time. Um, and as that increases, um, it's interesting because as the Overton window increases, um, you'll start seeing that, you know, these the horseshoe theory starts becoming null. But as the Overton window decreases, you start seeing the horseshoe theories, built upon, right? Because
Mm.
the socially accepted values start to merge into like this concentrated set of beliefs. I don't think, I think one of the best political systems I've ever seen in actuality is, I think it's called tribal communism or primitive communism. Um, it was practiced by the Native Americans. Um, Communism, I think it's called. Let me check. Yeah. It's literally hunter-gatherer societies. And even when they had a leader, the leader was so like it's, I don't think you can do that first of all with major groups. I think you're going to start getting corruption the larger a group gets. But up to a certain point, I think a lot of times this primitive communism, where the people truly hold the leader accountable, or the leaders accountable, like they truly hold them accountable, like they will revolt, they will kill the leaders. This is seen basically all Native American, not all, but a large majority of Native American um, groups, as well as the Aztecs and the Mayans. But what's interesting for them is they were affected theologically because they believed in all their gods and things like that. So that had a large part to play. I guess they were sort of a theocracy more than a primitive communistic society. But I think primitive communism is, with those small groups, are the best ones. But it's just not possible.
Talking about political thoughts in that sense, I think Elon Musk brought it up best when he said, like, we're kind of being ruled by this like class of older people in a sense. He sent out a tweet like, the people in the government, it's like all old people, and they've lost touch with like the younger folks, which like the mean age is, it's probably younger than the mean age in the legislature. And we think, maybe do they have the best ideas of the people at heart? They're not really representative in that sense.
Mm-hmm. I don't know.
Yeah. But do you think there's a better, like, that could be applied in America? Do you think there's a better like system that would be able to replace what we have right now?
No, I don't think we can replace the system. So I don't
Mm-hmm.
see. I know this is not what a lot of people would like to hear, but I don't think there's a point in looking for another system. I hope I'm wrong. I do hope
Mm-hmm.
I'm wrong, and I hope there is a better system out there, and I hope that one day it'll be implemented. But I don't think it will be.
Mm-hmm.
I was discussing with some other people a while back about how democracy is a prison. It was so perfectly made by the founding fathers that if if there was a way to make it to use it, for one group's um, necessitations, then it would be a prison. What would become an impenetrable fortress would be an inescapable prison. And we've kind of like dug a pit inside the fortress. So we're just falling more and more. And even if we did get to the top, I don't think we'd be able to um, leave what we've created efficiently. We can like build like ladders to get out of that pit, right? With all these amendments and passing laws to fix this, and maybe repealing certain acts that currently exist would make it better for us, like the people, and not just the government and not just America, but like the people itself. Maybe that would fill the ditch. I couldn't say for certain, but at the rate we're going, excuse me, it seems like the government is only going to push us deeper and deeper into this terrible situation that is only going to get worse because it has no bottom, I don't think.
Yeah. If if you had to pass a constitutional amendment right now, what do you think the most important thing would be?
Wow, that is a loaded question.
Mm.
Um, I can only choose
It's a
one.
thinker. Yeah. Well, you could give me three if you're conflicted.
Wow, three. That makes it so much better.
Whatever you're thinking.
Dang. I mean, I cannot just say what I'm thinking because that would be like, that'd be a major thing. Um, Three constitutional amendments. I could tell you what I would not think of doing.
Mm.
Um, okay, actually, no. I can tell you one of. I can tell you three possibly. So, and I like to think of our society as like three dimensions, right?
Hmm.
Like, I use the word dimension a lot, as my friends can testify. But there's the cyber dimension, cyberspace. There's our physical dimension, and I think there's the mental dimension, right? I think maybe what I can do is try to get an amendment for each. So I'm thinking um, an amendment that would, I'm not going to go into description, obviously, because I don't have that off the top of my head, but one amendment for cyber, at least, I can definitely tell you where they would restrict the amount of data just like shared among like all these different companies massively. Like, what is it that Ajit Pai controls? Is the FCC?
Yep. Federal
Yeah.
Communications Commission.
Yeah, maybe just shoot at Jit Pine. Yeah, definitely. There should be a much more liberal stance, I guess. If we have to group them into parties, I think Jit Pai should be replaced with a much more liberal counterpart.
Mm.
In terms of the physical, I would say the environment and global warming, and law should be, and an amendment should be passed to limit the amount of pollution, both in air and water and all that, because that's what physically affects us the most, more than any of this other stuff.
Yeah.
In fact, there's a very very cool theory, well, not cool, but I guess interesting, that by cutting into the forests, we're allowing pandemics like the coronaviruses to be exposed to us, because these
Really.
animals with the, let's say coronavirus, right? So like a bat or pangolin or whatever that was caught was deep inside the forest, and it came out because its home was disrupted, right? And it came out of the forest, and it was exposed to us, and that's a physical threat. And forgetting COVID, which is actually helping our, at least it was for a little while. I just read recently that the pollution is starting back up again because
Yeah.
things are opening. But while it was in full swing, like California, which is heavily polluted, like I think, I don't remember which parts I'm going to say, um, but one of the cities which is known for having a large, cloud of smog above it a lot of the time. Okay, so blue skies. Mumbai, Mumbai in India, one of the most heavily polluted places on earth. You could see the sky in all of its vibrant blue glory, and that's just awe-inspiring. But we have the ability to just change this by limiting pollution, and there are so many ways to stop pollution. All these companies saying, "Oh, it's too difficult." In terms of money, oh man, that would be terrible. But I think money is not the main concern. It's the
Hmm.
future generations. And I mean, like, come on, if the government wants to stay in power, like I would rather have the. Okay, actually, I don't know, but if the government wants to stay in power, any government officials are watching, so definitely not, because you have no subscribers.
I got three.
Three, yeah, okay.
Yeah.
Uh, if they did want to control future generations, they would need future generations to exist and not come out deformed, and. And I guess on the mental level, I think that one's the hardest. And I think it ties into the physical level as well. I don't think. I think we need to have another Andrew Jackson situation where the banks are destroyed.
Hmm.
Um, the banks control people. They allow for the ideology, which is consumerism, which was so greatly built upon after the world wars. Each time it was just only, stacked up. Consumerism is one of the best ways to affect people, more than control them. So I think stopping something like consumerism, though I don't know how you could just do that, you know, would greatly help. So I guess, yeah, those are the three amendments I would make. The mental one probably could fix it or change it to something else. But yeah, those are my three
Mhm.
amendments.
I think it is just building off the mental point. It's part of a broader societal issue we see where, particularly in the US, it's all about the individual and our individual gain and our goals, which don't necessarily benefit the other people. And that ties in with like the environment point too, because we care about our personal profits, what we're able to do with our money. And sometimes a lot of times actually, that comes at the detriment of the environment. But without proper oversight or without proper regulation, we see it just hurting them in the long term. But you have these businessmen, they don't care. They're going to be dead by the time that
Mm,
climate change really hits us hard unless we make substantive change. But the only people who can make substantive change are those people, older people in power. So it's kind of like a paradox in a sense.
I think that train of thought is flawed
Really.
because, yeah, not to totally go against what you're saying, but
Mm.
basically, I think what you're doing is think of it at the bottom of the pyramid, right? You have to go higher up, and you have to understand that there are definitely powerful families up there that it's weird. I think you're right in a sense. I think I don't think you can be wrong in this type of scenario. Maybe you can be, but you are definitely not incorrect. I think you're just looking at this in too small of a scale. There's a larger scale, and everyone forgets about the top of the pyramid all the time. It's up in the clouds, right? You don't look up there, can't. And I think um, there's definitely the need to be able to have a good grasp of future generations, and I strongly am in the belief that if they are to do a proper job of it, they need to, get their head out of the sand and look around and see that the populace is slowly wasting away, and or it will in when climate change becomes a much bigger problem than it is now. Because even though it is a big problem now and it should be considered a terrible threat to our everyday lives and the way America is based, um, it's not. And if they don't work to rectify this type of situation, they're not going to have the type of control they have over people anymore, and anarchy will be a possibility, I guess.
Yeah,
But well,
it would in the scenario where we don't address climate change, anarchy is the inevitable, and yeah,
yeah, and I think honestly that I think the only way to overthrow the government, if anybody ever wanted to overthrow the government, that they just have to facilitate climate change. It's like the worst thing I could possibly say, but
yeah,
that's not impossible.
I guess that's true. Yeah, it's weird to think like that, though.
Hmm.
What do you think?
Well, I think people who think in the weird ways are able to see different perspectives that most people are unable to. So
Yeah,
even though it's weird, I think it's wonderful.
yeah, seeing the unique angles on issues sometimes. I think maybe even most of the time, the unique and different angles are usually the right ones instead of like the group
Yeah,
think.
yeah, definitely. Um, Once you understand that a lot of society is a means to control the individual and populace, you start opening your eyes, and opening your eyes is so important as you grow up. Coming of age is like something that's studied a lot in schools, or at least in the books that are presented to a lot of students. Like To Kill a Mockingbird, and I think recently a separate piece was included. They focus on like the idea of a coming of age, and they focus on other people's perspectives of these minor coming of age things. Um, I wish they would give. I wish. I'm sure there are. I should actually look into that coming of age books where people realize that um, society in the end is not your friend. As
Hmm.
much as it serves its purpose for certain. We need society. Without society, we too will fall. Humans need society. Hunter gatherers, since that time till now, we need to be in a group of people. We cannot be alone. We need others to help us survive. But for ourselves to succeed more than to survive, we need to game society,
Hmm.
which it's good for people who like know that, because then they can, and it allows them to unfortunately game the system, which is at the same time holding other people back, which is why capitalism is, I think, better than the current communism that we see in today's day and age. Um, capitalism allows people to rise in a way that socialism or communism or even fascism would totally not allow those people to do.
Hmm. Yeah, it is. It's part of a greater ideological dialogue that I think we might not be having in today's political climate. We're kind of stuck in the sand, like you said, into thinking like what we're doing it's that way or the highway, but we're not seeing all these other ways that we could be going about things. And
Mm-hmm.
that might be the wrong way to approach going forward with governance.
There are a lot of wrong ways and very few right ways.
Yeah. Well, Zeke, I am getting tired, but I think that
I
is a
could
good
tell.
note. I think it's a good note to leave off on. So
Uh-huh.
that is the end. I will find the button of the second episode.